The Grumman F4F Wildcat was a U.S. monoplane naval fighter design that saw combat throughout most of World War II for the U.S. Navy and the British Navy Fleet Air Arm. As this video will cover the British variants of this plane, be sure to watch the U.S. variants video, as that covers the plane from its conception to production, if you have not seen it already. Be sure to click the link attached in this video. As these foreign variants were based off of U.S. produced aircraft, I will denote which U.S. version it was originally based on, then continue with the specific variant. In 1939, the French and British governments were searching for additional combat aircraft to supplement their air forces. Even before the Grumman F4F-III Wildcat came into U.S. Navy service, both the French and British ordered variations based off of the F4F-III model, with some slight modifications. Just as a recap, the early F4F-III was equipped with 4 Browning M.II 50 caliber machine guns, and was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1830-76 twin wasp with a 2-stage supercharger. Known as the Grumman G36A, the French Navy contract consisted of 81 aircraft with an additional 10 that could be built in spare parts. The French planned to use the G36A for their aircraft carriers. 4 major changes were made from the base American F4F-III model. The first was an engine swap. The French variant included a 1,000 horsepower Wright R1820-G205 radial mated to an uncuffed Hamilton standard propeller. The second change consisted of installing a shorter and narrow cowling, which eliminated the cowling flaps and added a carburetor air scoop. The third major difference was the cockpit. In addition to being equipped with a reflector gun sight upon delivery, rather than the U.S. Navy's telescopic gun sight, the plane would be fit out with metric instruments. One unique cockpit change the French requested was that the throttle linkage was to be modified to conform with a pre-war practice of pulling the lever backwards towards the pilot for more power. This differed from the now normal practice of pushing the throttle forwards and towards the firewall for more power. The last major difference was in armament. Instead of the 4 50 caliber Brownings in the wings, the French opted for 6 7.5mm down machine guns, with 2 in the nose cowling and 2 in each wing. These guns were to be installed on delivery, along with other French-specific gear, such as the gun sights and the radio equipment. In early 1940, the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm also had an interest in acquiring Grumman's new F4F-III design, in fact, ordering 100 with their own changes. Known as the G36B, this aircraft varied slightly from the F4F-III. A new engine, a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830-S3C4-G twin wasp, was linked to an uncuffed Hamilton standard propeller. The air scoop in the upper inlet was omitted, and the cowling had a single double-wide flap in the rear on each side. There were no other major changes when these planes were initially ordered. In mid-May 1940, the first French contract G36A was test flown. However, as France fell in June 1940, the G36A order was taken over by the British, now known as the Martlet Mark I. All 81 aircraft and the 10 spares, which were to be fully built before delivery, were sent over to Britain. Unfortunately, 10 were lost en route as the ship carrying them was torpedoed. The remaining 81 would reach Britain by the end of 1940. One note was 7 of the now 81 were already built to French standards as the contract moved to the British, and these were converted to Fleet Air Arm standards when they arrived. All 6 French guns were removed, even the 2 in the cowling. One issue that plagued these 7 Mark Is for their entire service career was once the 7.5mm machine guns were removed from the wings, 2 Browning M.II 50 caliber machine guns in each wing were installed on the French-designed gun mounts. This was not a perfect fit and caused issues with gun performance. Another note, even though the Mark Is possessed the same armament as the American F4F-III, the guns were more spread out in each wing. These Mark Is would enter service in July 1940, a month in advance of the U.S. Navy receiving their first F4F-III. Used on land bases a majority of the time, these models were primarily relegated as training and familiarity aircraft, however, a small number of which were used for training on British aircraft carriers. In December 1940, Martlet Mark Is would gain the first air-to-air kill for the Grumman F4F design, with 2 sharing a kill of a German Junkers Ju-88 bomber near the Scapa Flow naval base. In March 1940, the British contract for the G36B was beginning to be filled at Grumman. At this time, Grumman was testing and implementing a revolutionary folding wing design called the stow wing. With this new development in the F4F design, which would later be implemented on the F4F-4, The Fleet Air Arm amended their contract to have their G-36Bs with folding wings, to maximize storage of the fighter on their aircraft carriers. As the contract was amended after production began, the original 100 G-36Bs were built as non-folding wing models. The rest of the 90 aircraft were built with folding wings. This lot would be dubbed Martlet Mk.IIs, with the 10 non-folding planes known as the non-standard Mk.IIs, until they were converted to the amended specifications. The original contract specifications to include the Pratt & Whitney S3C4-G engine and the British equipment were maintained. The Mk.IIs, in addition to the folding wings, now featured 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns as the final change. These were added due to suggestions by the British based on their combat experience. This model was now more similar to the US Navy's, at the time, F4F-4 than the original F4F-3 it was based on. The Mk.IIs would enter service in October 1940, with 46 being sent to England and the remaining 54 sent off to the Far East and India. In mid-1940, Greece was concerned with the new alliance between Italy and Germany, as an invasion by Italy became a startling possibility. The Greeks requested assistance from the Allies to help defend from this likely invasion. The United States offered assistance by diverting 30 Grumman F4Fs to the Greeks. In late 1940, Grumman would be testing a slight variant of the F4F-3, the F4F-3A, as the production and engineering for the Pratt & Whitney R-1830-76 engine for the American F4F-3 was going through some hiccups. The US Navy requested that other engines were put to the test as insurance policies. The successful option was a Pratt & Whitney R-1830-90 twin-WAS radial with a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. With marginal difference in flight characteristics and minimal cowling changes, 95 F4F-3As were ordered for the US Navy. During the production run, 30 of the F4F-3As were completed and taken off the assembly line to be used to fulfill the emergency Greek contract. These aircraft were to be flown by the Hellenic Air Force. As these aircraft made their way across the Atlantic via merchant vessels, Greece fell to Germany in April 1941. When the planes were at British-held Gibraltar, close to their initial destination, the Fleet Air Arm took the batch of 30 for their own use. These orphaned aircraft would be dubbed Martlet Mk.III. Primarily serving on land bases in North Africa, Mk.III saw action attacking German and Italian installations during the North Africa campaign. They were minimally used on aircraft carriers due to their non-folding wings, seeing action during a convoy escort to Malta, claiming 4 German and Italian fighters for a loss of 3 Martlets in August 1942. With the success of the stowing tested and implemented on British Martlet Mk.IIs, the US Navy went forward with introducing the next step succeeding the F4F-3. To recap, the first prototype of the US Navy's F4F-4 was completed in April 1941 and featured 3 major changes. These were the previously mentioned hydraulically folding wings, 2 additional 50 caliber machine guns, 1 in each wing as implemented in the Martlet Mk.IIs, additional armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. The production run F4F-4 would eliminate the hydraulics in the wings in favor of manual folding wings for weight saving. Like in the Mk.II design, the outboard 2 guns were initially suggested by the British due to their combat experience. However, decreasing rounds per gun from 450 to 240 rounds caused disapproval among US Navy pilots later when they saw combat. These 2 outboard guns could be switched on and off based on their pilot preference. Additional armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were integrated into the design initially, instead of retrofitting these features later in the production like in the F4F-3. This element was based off of British suggestions on account of their experience in the skies over Europe. The British-specific model had a few modifications that deviated from the F4F-4. Known internally as export model F4F-4B, the Martlet Mk.IV introduced a Wright R1820-40B Cyclone engine with minor tweaks to the cowling. Just as a side note, the F4F-4 featured 1200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 twin WASP with a 2-stage supercharger, same as the late production F4F-3. The Mk.IV would use a uncuffed Hamilton standard propeller instead of the cuffed Curtiss Electric propeller used on the F4F-4. This cowling was more compact and featured no lip intake and decreased the number of flaps from 4 single flaps on each side to a single double-wide cowling flap. 220 Mk.IVs would enter Fleet Air Arm service in July 1942, first seeing combat during Operation Torch in November 1942. These combat aircraft would serve on escort carriers in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, but would also see service in the Pacific theater. The Mk.IVs would operate off Madagascar, India, and throughout the South Pacific, working with the US Pacific Fleet. In 1942, Grumman began working on the design and production of additional aircraft, mainly the F4F's successor, the F6F Hellcat. General Motors, acting under the name Eastern Aircraft Division, took on the role of continuing building the F4F under license build production in mid-1942. Eastern Aircraft would continue the F4F-4, known as the FM-1, with one major difference. The two outboard guns would be removed, bringing armament back to 4 50 caliber machine guns. The British, still interested in the F4F design, would order 312 of the Martlet Mark V, but would only receive 311 due to one being destroyed in a post-production test that was never replaced. The Fleet Air Arm would accept this aircraft as is from General Motors, even including the reduction in armament. Receiving the first two Martlet Mark Vs in late 1942, these General Motor-built fighters were used on British escort carriers later in the war, the same as the US Navy. Some operations the Mark V took part in were the attacks on the German battleship Tirpitz, and they were used as fighter cover for the Allied landings in Salerno, Italy. In early 1944, the Martlet name was dropped by the British for all existing types, conforming with the US Navy nickname Wildcat. This version was now dubbed the Wildcat Mark V. Before F4Fs were being built by General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division, Grumman moved forward with a new variant of the Wildcat, known as the XF4F-8, in mid-1942. As a recap, after some testing, an up-powered version of the Wildcat was introduced. The most notable changes from previous models included a more powerful 1,350 horsepower Curtiss R1820-56W engine, with a single-stage supercharger mated to an uncuffed Curtiss electric propeller, and an 8.5-inch taller tail to compensate for the additional power and torque. Armament stayed at 4 50 caliber machine guns, and the Wildcat's iconic belly windows were omitted. Under license, these were produced by Eastern Aircraft as the FM-II Wildcat. The Fleet Air Arm would order 370 of this final variant, first arriving for service in July 1944, dubbing them the Wildcat Mark VI. These aircraft were identical to the US Navy's FM-II Wildcats. The Wildcat Mark VI would primarily see service in the Pacific Theater, but a few squadrons would be equipped with them in the Atlantic. Along with anti-shipping and anti-U-boat operations, the Wildcat Mark VI would support Operation Dragoon, the Allied landings in southern France in August 1944. The last British Wildcat victory would be in March 1945. 4 Wildcat Mark VIs were ambushed by several Messerschmitt Bf-109s over Norway. 4 Bf-109s were shot down for 1 damaged Wildcat Mark VI. With the close of the war in September 1945, the Fleet Air Arm tallied 53 enemy aircraft destroyed by all versions of the Martlet/Wildcats. Their records show 10 Fleet Air Arm Grummans were lost in combat, giving them a respectable 5.3 to 1 kill ratio compared to the US Navy and Marine 6.9 to 1. Along with its US counterparts, the Martlet/Wildcats were instrumental to the war effort in both the European and Pacific theaters of war. In addition with being satisfactory gun platform, these British Grummans served as air cover escort for crucial convoys, kept U-boats at bay, and played a significant role in ground attack missions. Admittedly, I learned a lot during my research on the British counterparts of the Grumman F4F. Let me know in the comments what aircraft you would like to see me do a variants video for. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.